Okay, well, welcome to the second uh, episode, so to speak, of the History of the Present series. I'm Mark Gilbert. I'm Professor of History and International Studies here at SAIS Europe. Now, the objective of this series is to discuss major developments in contemporary global politics. Developments that are going on now, which are likely to have, or indeed are certain to have, historical scope, not just minor technical shifts. I don't want us to get lost in technicalities. Our first speaker back in October was Dan Markey of SAIS, who was talking about China's extensive diplomatic ambitions. Whereas today's speaker, will be addressing the major issue of the ongoing and unresolved, indeed, according to him, existential crisis of the European Union. Now, our speaker tonight is Agustín Menéndez of the Autonomous University of Madrid, who also cooperates with ARENA, which is the European Studies Center at the University of Oslo. And Agustín has just become professor of political philosophy in Madrid. His academic formation is in public law. He is, I suppose, a philosopher of law in many ways, but his work spans across EU law, human rights, constitution making, economic rights and welfare, the ethics of taxation, citizenship. Need I go on? Oh, yes, one thing. He also works on wicked legal systems. Now, I always thought wicked legal systems were because of the lawyers, but he can no doubt explain that to me. He was editor for many years and until very recently at the European Law Journal, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is one of the leading journals in the field. And he is really one of the most widely cited and referenced legal scholars in Europe today. But more to the point, because we all get rather hung up about citations, he is a wide-ranging thinker and public intellectual of importance in the contemporary European debate. And his work on the EU's existential crisis is something which has aroused a great deal of discussion, not only in his native Spain, but in other parts of Europe too. Agustín thinks outside the box, brings insights from different disciplines, and I'm sure he will have many interesting thoughts to share with us this evening. Agustín, it's a great pleasure to have you here to talk to you again. It's a great pity we shan't see each other at the end of this meeting, but I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for over two generous words. And it's a genuine honor to be tonight with you. Tonight, I would like to discuss or to try to seek answers together with you to three main questions. The first, and the most obviously related to the general theme of the lectures, concerns indeed the history of the present in many ways, and is to reflect about what the many crises that have hit the European Union since 2007 have taught us about the European Union, and in particular about its history. In the wake of the Single European Act and of the Maastricht Treaty, Europeanists, whether they be lawyers, economists, or political scientists, or for that matter, many involved in doing implicit or explicit history of European integration, tended to take for granted that European integration was a long march forward towards the United States of Europe through incremental but decisive steps. In the wake of the financial, economic, fiscal, refugee, territorial, democratic crisis, and I could even refer more, likely to be amplified by the COVID-19 health crisis, we may ask ourselves what is left of that view and how the history of European integration looks like. The second question concerns the crises themselves. There is lots of talk about crises, but we may wonder what these crises are and what concrete changes the crises themselves and the many attempts at governing them have brought about in the way in which power is organized in Europe. As events unfolded, the media transmitted the impression of on the hoof decision-making. With the benefit of hindsight that we have now, what patterns can be recognized, what trends can be discerned, what has happened, what changes have been brought to the European Union. The third question is about the last external shock, the coronavirus crisis, the health crisis, but also its social, economic, and political implications. Commentators, pundits, and quite some scholars were keen to argue in the early summer of this year that while the challenge that coronavirus posed to the European Union in general and to the Eurozone in particular was a massive one, this time around, contrary to what happened in the 2007-2010 financial and fiscal crisis, Europe had a plan. The plan was called the EU Next Generation Plan, which did not only equip the Union to help the European economy recover from the crisis, but also to undertake ambitious structural changes needed to make Europe ready to be at the avant-garde of the fight against climate change. Are these claims justified? Do they stand the test of a close reading of the decisions adopted by the European Union? This is what lawyers are supposed to be good at doing, that is reading documents. In view of the present institutional structure, decision-making process, and substantive norms? So these are the three questions. Questions that have to do with what, if anything, can we learn about the overall unfolding of European integration on the basis of the crisis. The second is what changes the crisis have caused. And the third concerns specifically the coronavirus crisis and whether this time around it is justified to say that Europe is better equipped to deal with the crisis than what we have seen in the previous ones, which were, I would argue, postponed but not solved at all. The first question. To many, if not most Europeanists, the history of European integration remains the slow but steady unfolding of the goals already set in the founding treaties. This teleological reading of the history of European integration has emphasized continuities and downplayed discontinuities. It is interesting to notice in that regard that the 70s, the decade of the Eurosclerosis, which many experience as one of paralysis, if not regression, of European integration, is not so much reconsidered as set aside as a kind of exception. This is the vision which has informed most writing on European integration in the last 30 years, even if only implicitly or unconsciously. Few dare to go against the current and denounce the pitfalls of interpreting the past in view of the present, while assuming that the future is bound to be an improved version of the present. Mark Gilbert was for a period a rather lonely voice reminding us of the perils of weak history and weak narratives. And for that, and I would like very much to insist on that, we have to be deeply thankful to him. The European integration field, so to say. Misquoting Harold Macmillan, events are forcing Europeanists out of their comfort theoretical zones. Since 2007, 2008, I insist on 2007 because it's really when the financial crisis started, even if the spectacular manifestation of the crisis was the fall of Lehman Brothers, the trouble was already brewing, very obviously, from 2007. Since then, to ignore that history is impossible, is hard, at least, to ignore that history never ended, least of all in a continent that went to hell and back only some 80 years ago. It is not only that in some respect crises have been more effective causes of change than incremental reforms, but that the experience of break and rupture has opened our eyes to the discontinuities in the history of European integration. There are many examples. I will not go into them now, but we could discuss them afterwards. I think a very obvious one is the European Central Bank, which was a limited, powerful, but limited, modest central bank as it was designed. We all know now that the European Central Bank is everything but modest. And only to give a figure, the European Central Bank now holds approximately 25% of the Eurozone GDP public debt, which is enormous amount, which implies that the neat distinction between monetary and fiscal policy has simply collapsed. And this creates a considerable number of deep constitutional and political problems, not least the legitimacy of what the European Central Bank is doing. And this is the background, most of you would have heard about that, of the judicial saga, the Vice saga, that exploded in the middle of the coronavirus crisis on May 5th with a ruling of the German Constitutional Court. Now, to offer you a detailed non-wit history of European integration would be like carrying iron to Newcastle, given that Mark Gilbert is here tonight, and even more so within weeks of the publication of a new edition of his superb monograph and textbook on the matter. I would only like to share with you some thoughts, very limited thoughts, on how this could look like from the point of view of a constitutional law reconstruction of European integration, only some indications. It seems to me in that regard that overcoming Whiggism requires underlining the ambivalence of the founding acts of the European communities, the extent to which such ambivalence was solved in favor of developing the communities as a complement, not an alternative to national democratic and social states, to the states that emerge in the post-war constitutional settlement of the late 40s, most obviously, but not exclusively, in Italy, France, Germany, to the extent that Germany got a constitution and not a fundamental law. I will not go into the distinctions, but there are differences between the two, but also in Belgium, also in the Netherlands, also in Luxembourg, even if they did not have a constitution-making process, there were changes in the political constitution, so to say, not in the formal constitution, even if there were also amendments. Now, this settlement was turned in its head after the crisis of the 70s in the process of creating the conditions for the financial and economic crisis that hit Europe in the late noughties. I said, I want to deal with the other questions. I cannot devote all my time to this. But I would say two things that I think should be obvious, but they are not so obvious from the point of view of European constitutional law or European law as such. The first is that there is a big difference between the type of a state that was established, or the idea of the state that was established after the Second World War, and the one preceding Second World War, the kind of ideal of the relation between state, society, and economy that was prevailing, a legacy in many ways of the long liberal 19th century. This is, of course, something that has been highlighted by Polanyi, The Great Transformation, but in the political science literature by Draghi, the famous 82 Embedded Liberalism article. And whether you agree or disagree with Polanyi and Draghi, there is one thing on which I think they are right, and is establishing this difference between how the two were understood. The role, for example, that trade was supposed to play in the life of the polity, the extent to which external trade was not an objective in itself, but was a means in order to achieve socioeconomic goals, the extent to which, for example, there was to be an element of limitation of movement of capital in order to ensure the free movement of goods, and to the extent that this was possible, the free movement of persons. The second, very obvious, is that there is a shift, as I was already hinting, taking place in the 70s, that from the point of view of European law has to do with the movement from the common to the single market, and from the common to the single currency. I will not go into details, but the role that the state is supposed to play in the two is different. The degree, using the word of, using the concept of Polanyi, of embeddedness of the economy into the wider society, is rather different. There is discontinuity here. We have to distinguish different ways in which the European communities were relating to the national states, and the way in which national states themselves were being configured. Because, again, I don't have time to go into detail here, but very obviously, what we are learning out of the recent crisis is also that changes that happen at the European level are the result at the same time that they influence the changes that are happening at the national level. And obviously, the fact that in 81 Thatcher came to power, in 82 Kohl came to power, and in 83 Mitterrand undertook the U-turn in terms of economic policy, all coalesce in terms of creating the conditions under which the single act of 86-87, Single European Act of 86-87 was possible. It has been neglected, and only we have been reminded of the central importance, for example, of the European monetary system, of the decisions that were taken at the end of 78 regarding the European monetary infrastructure, how determinant they were of the path that was followed afterwards. I think, for example, now it would be rather obvious that the salience of the Maastricht Treaty was considerable, but was much less than what was assumed in the 90s and in the noughties, to the extent that the European monetary system, that there was an ambivalent decision itself and was the result of lots of contingencies, and also agency was very relevant on how it was shaped. But the European monetary system was introducing through economic logic, or through what was implicit in the economic decisions, many of the rules that were, or the norms and the principles that were later codified in the Maastricht Treaty. The Johns Hopkins University is in a privileged position because it's an American university in Italy. So you have two worlds that you are dealing with, but you are also in Italy. In Italy, it's very well known. For example, it's something that has acquired a different importance seen from the crisis, the so-called divorzio between the Treasury and Banca Italia, the decision that the Banca Italia will no longer be the buyer of last resort of the bonds issued by Banca Italia. Funnily enough, we have come back to such a position from the moment in which quantitative easing has been practiced by the European Central Bank, and especially during the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic emergency purchase program, we have come full circle in many ways. But this decision in 81 is one that is anticipating the clear distinction between Treasury and Central Bank, the independence of the Central Bank, if you wish, that happened afterwards. Only, I would say, I refrain myself in the, I have produced a paper that you can consult. There are more details, but I only wanted to give some indications of how the way in which we were looking at the history of European integration necessarily has changed out of the experience of the crisis. The crisis has provided us the lenses, or has adjusted our lenses, and now we see things that we were not seeing, or we are seeing under a different light things that were taken for granted before. The result of that, basically, I would say, as I anticipated, is that there is much more emphasis on discontinuity. We are able to see more clearly the different breaks that have characterized the history of European integration. This is normalizing history of European integration in many ways. This is stopping to consider that for some strange reason, European integration was different from other historical processes, which are characterized by discontinuities, ruptures, breaks, in which events which look like having a certain implications, then out of later events get a different one. As I was saying, for example, this is very clear with the European monetary system, which was not already predetermined in itself, but was the result of what was made out of the European monetary system. That ended up being a forerunner of Maastricht, and ended up conditioning or creating the conditions under which Maastricht was possible. So much for the first question. Let's tackle the second question, which is, what can we say about how the European Union has got transformed by the crisis? On that regard, I would propose, and I almost certain that I will not be successful, but I will try nevertheless, to try to suggest one concept that comes from, is not a legal concept, but it was used by German constitutional lawyers at the end of the 19th century. And I think it is fitting in order to understand what has happened, and is the idea of mutation, of constitutional mutation. Is the idea that we have had fundamental changes in the way in which public power is organized in Europe that are not the result of the procedures which were supposed to be used for that purpose, at the same time that they are neither incremental necessarily. They can be as quick and as sudden as a process of explicit reform, so to say. So this will be in contrast to evolutionary forms of constitutional change. So from that perspective, what I would say is that what we can draw from the crisis is that there has been a radicalization and acceleration of a constitutional mutation that started before, but was accelerated and radicalized by the crisis. And I think on that regard, I would say two things. The first is that this requires seeing the different crises as manifestations, different angles, different perspectives, different elements in a wider crisis. That is what I have been calling since quite a number of years, the existential crisis. This has been used in other more metaphysical or more philosophical ways, as also pointing to a crisis of values. Or the point is not that. The point is a much more modest one of referring to the fact that the very survival of the thing is at risk. That the very identity of what the European Union is at stake. That's the idea of existential. The existence of the European Union is in crisis, not any more Heideggerian or Sartrean kind of background here, a much more plain kind of understanding of existential. So we have many crises. I have already made reference to several of them. But these different crises can be understood as aspects of a wider crisis, a crisis of the European Union as such, which then manifest in different ways, which are deeply interrelated. I would claim, for example, that we have a democratic crisis that is related to events we know in Poland and Hungary, also in Romania, also in Malta, also in many other European countries in different degrees. And this democratic crisis is generally misunderstood because it's not related to the other crisis. There is a lot of moralizing about the crisis. I would not say from whom, but you can follow the media discussion, and there is lots of moralizing, and partially rightly so. But at the same time, there is a, how to put it, a reluctance to dig deeper in terms of the causes of this democratic crisis. For example, to my knowledge, there is only some, not least Eastern Europeans themselves, lonely voices in the debate, that insist at the same time expressing their deep concern about what is going on, emphasizing the big tension that characterized the way in which these countries entered the European Union. On the one hand, they were welcome because they were democratizing countries that were on the democratic path, coming home to the European Union. At the same time, what they were expected to do was to accept in toto, as a whole, the European acquis, the norms governing the European Union. There was a tension there, because if you are supposed to be becoming a democratic country, but at the same time you are told what to do, step by step, this is not exactly exercising your right to democratic choice. It's just the opposite. At the same time, you are told that you should develop your own state capacities, your administration, and in order to become part of the European Union, many of those who are part of this administration become part of the administration of the European Union. So there are lots of tensions there. At the same time, for example, I think there has been rather de-emphasizing of the implications of the way in which Europe governed the crisis, the financial and the fiscal crisis, on the development of the conditions under which you could have the developments on the ground in Poland and Hungary. So I think there is an element of disconnection. If you try to put them together, you get a better picture of the whole thing. Again, only some initial ideas which could perhaps be developed in the discussion. I think it is very obvious that the beginning of the crisis cycle is the financial crisis. But the financial crisis, especially in the European Union, especially in the Eurozone, has been usually misunderstood. It has been labeled as after the Greek crisis as a crisis of public debt. I would argue is not an idiosyncratic idea of mine. For example, you have the former vice president of the European Central Bank, Victor Constancio, who has reiteratedly been arguing in the same, that this is a crisis of private debt. It's a result of financiarization, and financiarization explains also the flow of capital inundating the periphery of the Eurozone, which ended up, as it tends to do, badly. So I think it is important that we get right that this is a private debt crisis. And at the same time, I think it is important to take into account that this was related to the long-term crisis of the post-model economic, socio-economic model. Whether you like that model or not, is very clear that by the end of the 60s already, it was showing its limits. And the way out, or one of the ways in which exit has been attempted, has been the growth of finance, which has postponed distributive conflicts, but only postponed them. Has been a matter, to quote the influential book of Wolfgang Streeck, a way of buying time. And the day of the reckoning was basically 2007, 2008. But because we have not solved the underlying problem, that is finding an alternative socioeconomic model that could work, the day of the reckoning is also in the future. It will keep on haunting us. And one indication that this is so is that we have this mass that I already referred of public debt park in the European Central Bank, which legally is impossible to deal with. It cannot be simply monetized, contrary to what the Fed or the Bank of England could do. The European Central Bank cannot do that. And at the same time, it cannot be placed again in the markets, because after 5 minutes, the Eurozone will have collapsed. So there is this kind of catch-22 there. The third, I think, is also important to keep in mind, is that the crisis, even if it was presented as an American crisis, because it originated in the subprime market in the US, was to all effects much more intense in Europe. And this reflects something that has been neglected in most of the debate, which is also the dependence, the financial dependence of the Eurozone on the US. What has been stressed, if at all, from the point of view of some developmental economics, as the dollarization, which you can obviously, if you read, for example, the very important book of Adam Tooze on the crisis, you can obviously see that American institutional actors are key in the unfolding of the Eurozone crisis, and this is not by chance. This is related to the dependence that exists, and that Europeans wanted to believe had come to an end with the development of the euro. This is not true. And we can see, for example, that after any of the different episodes of the crisis, one of the key solutions is that there is swap lines being extended by the Fed to European banks through the ECB, which means that the US keeps on having a central role. And there has been not much of gaining ground of the euro in terms of international trade since the euro was introduced. So the problem remains there. The goal of having more room of maneuver, more autonomy, has not been realized. Then came the fiscal and the migratory crisis. I will not go into the details here. I would only like to stress that what they reflect is a structural problem of the European Union, which is the addiction to emergency government. Because what you see in the fiscal and the migratory crisis is the repetition of a sequence, which starts with ignoring the problem, denying reality, denying that there is a problem. Greece was a very slow derailing. The train was coming off the tracks at slow motion for months, and the European Union was denying that there was a problem. The number of migrants coming from Syria and Libya was going up from 2012, and the problem was denied. I remember very vividly one boat was sinking before Lampedusa and 800 people died, and the European Council decided to postpone deciding, which I think it is typical of this phase of denial. The second step is taking manifestly inadequate solutions, solutions that fit, that look great because they manage to have an agreement within the European Council, which is extremely difficult. And then they are deeply satisfied that they manage to get the agreement, but that confronted with reality are manifestly inadequate. And you have these during the fiscal crisis. For example, you have the different rescue packages of Greece in 2010 and 2012 that obviously were not solving the problem, were only kicking the can down the road. And you have this with the refugee crisis through the reallocation decisions taken in 2015, which were foreseeing to reallocate less refugees in 2 years than they were arriving in 1 month to Greece. So this was manifestly inadequate. Obviously, this could not work. But because they could agree, I insist, they thought this was the solution. They were making a mistake. They were taking as a solution what they could agree with, not what reality required, so to say. Now, the crisis entered a new stage when they stop being only about economics. They stop being about the consequences of the very strange way in which migration and asylum policy were Europeanized in the 80s, and they become deeply political, if they were not political enough before, with political manifestations that I would say are the territorial crisis, Brexit, but also think about Catalonia, think about Scotland before and after Brexit, and also what I already referred, the democratic crisis in Poland and in Hungary. And as I said, I think that it's very important to look at the facts, but also to look at the causes. And there, for example, with Brexit, you can make many arguments about structural problems with the decision-making process in Westminster. You can make all kind of arguments. You can go into the literature that talks about this as a populistic movement. I don't know exactly what populism is, so I try to refrain from using the concept, which is extremely fancy. But the key question there is that there are underlying structural problems that were unsolved for a long time. It was a problem, among other things, of political parties refusing to articulate distributive conflicts that then become translated into territorial conflicts and conflicts about exclusion and inclusion. This is very obvious, for example, in the case of the rather, how to put it, ambitious characterization of its own thinking, for example, by Orbán as illiberal democracies. I have problems with the concept. I would be of the idea that other concepts that have been used are more fitting there. But at any way, the issue is complex and has its roots, for example, very obviously, in the case of Hungary, has its roots, as I was saying, not only on how they integrated into the European Union, but also how they went out of the communist ruling, the years of communism. It was during years celebrated the way in which they have a negotiated transition. The negotiated transition has also shown its limits, because there was also not an appropriation like it happened in post-war Europe of the fundamental norms organizing the polity. So, for example, it was a relatively easy for Orbán to target the Hungarian constitution and to reform the Hungarian constitution, because it lacked this strong democratic legitimacy. To conclude there, I would say that the different crises can be used in order to draw lessons about the changes that, if I'm allowed to use the constitutional jargon here, the changes that have happened in the constitutional law of the European Union. Very briefly, in 1 minute, I would say that the states have been weakened, while the European Union has not gained major positive powers, but only the capacity to constrain states, the result of which is that neither the European Union nor the member states can put in place many positive policies that we took for granted in the democratic and the social state. There is a combination of rigidity and informality. Decision-making is so rigid that when the crisis comes, you move immediately to emergency mode. And in the emergency mode, there are no rules about the limits of power, which is extremely dangerous, not only in democratic terms, but also because you can make very dangerous mistakes. And the result is that this has proven toxic to the main pillar of the democratic and social state, political parties, as power has progressively been placed in the hands of epistocratic and technocratic institutions and key private actors. If there is a winner from the crisis, this is the European Central Bank, which is an institution that is supposed to be aloof from democratic politics, and which, if you listen to the people that work at the European Central Bank, has no illusions about its own capacity to play the role that increasingly it's being required to play. So we are here in a very delicate situation because of the transformations deal lead us into an unstable constitutional settlement, to paraphrase the title of one political scientist specialized on the European Union. Third question, and time is running. The COVID crisis, the coronavirus crisis. Well, from what I have been saying, it's very obvious that the waters in which Europe navigated by March 2020 were full of wandering minds ready to explode as soon as they were touched. The manifold crises converging on the existential crisis of the European Union were postponed but not solved. And then the monster entered. The coronavirus shocked us, and with their dire consequences in terms of health, with deaths that keep on growing, and in terms of a deep economic crisis, as we have not known since not only the Second World War, but probably for more than a century, with the GDP shrinking by more than 10%, in some countries perhaps by 15%, which is a staggering amount. It is a collective impoverishment unheard of, is the result of the war, so to say. Now, or even more than a war in some cases. The optimistic reading is that the crisis is there, but this time the European Union has a plan. And the plan is Europe Next Generation, that will provide the European Union with the mutualization of debt, which would move the European Union one step ahead towards federal union. I think there are reasons to be very, we should be very cautious, we should be skeptical about whether this is the right reading of the situation. For three reasons that I will very briefly rehearse now. The first is that the assumption that is made is the EU Next Generation is good because it's a good plan of public investment in order to relaunch the economy after the crisis. My very modest observation is that the crisis is not over. We are still in the depth of the crisis. We are hopeful that we will get the vaccine, that we will be able to put it in the past, the crisis, but we do not know when. Until then, it's not the time to reconstruct, it's the time to keep the economy afloat. And that is a big challenge for all economies, but it's especially a challenge for the Eurozone, for the simple reason that even before the coronavirus shock hit the European Union, there was divergence within the European Union growth. And it is bound to increase. I would not go into the details. I will only invite you to read one document that has been neglected and has been produced by the European Commission itself. It's a technical document of May 27th. And in this document, what the European Commission does in very correct technocratic way is to calculate how much money the European Union should put on the table in order to keep afloat the single market and the single currency, to avoid that there is divergence between the member states that imperils the very continuity of the single market and the single currency. And the figures are not about future investment, such as is the case with the EU Next Generation, but are, I insist, on money that is necessary to keep afloat the economy, to keep all the boats afloat. And it's calculated that the European Union should be injecting, not the member state, the European Union should be injecting between 600 and 900 billion in 2020, which it will not be doing. And at the same time, to keep socioeconomic inequalities within bounds, it will be necessary an expenditure of 192 billion euro. I think they are modest in their estimations. The question is not whether you want to redistribute resources or not. The question is whether you want to avoid differences being so deep that the very idea that there is a level playing field in the single market keeps on being half valid. This is the point. And this is not being done because it was supposed that we have the big hit in the spring and then there was recovery. But recovery is not here. What we have is a second wave, perhaps a third wave, who knows, if a fourth wave, before we can get out of that through vaccination. The second is that austerity is supposed to be over. I think this is premature. Austerity is about distributing losses. In 2008, we got poorer out of the crisis. Now we got even poorer. And whether we are applying austerity or not does not depend on whether we use public debt to cushion the shock, but how we distribute the losses afterwards. And we are not afterwards. We have not reached that point. Moreover, we are avoiding that point. If you read the EU Next Generation documents, there is lots of talk about own resources, which in the jargon of the European Union means taxes, but there is very little about taxes themselves. And taxes are the way of distributing losses. You would need to have a decision about taxes in order to be able to say that austerity is over. I don't see that. So I think it is premature. Perhaps there will be that. I don't know. At this stage, we don't have it. It is over-optimistic to conclude, therefore, that we have it. And the third part is how the EU Next Generation is being characterized itself. And I think, again, this is, for several reasons, over-optimistic. I will only rehearse two in telegraphic terms. If you read the documents, you get the impression that there is an enormous amount of money coming out of EU Next Generation. There is the envelope, as they say in these circles, is 750 billion euro. But this is in the whole period, the whole budgetary period, and at best, it will be concentrated on 3 years. which actually means that this implies an expenditure of 1.5 GDP of the Eurozone per year during 3 years. This is modest in terms of the kind of crisis that we are confronted. This is a good public investment program, I would say, but it's modest, again, in order to tackle the effects of the crisis for reasons that I already pointed. Moreover, the regular budget of the European Union is reduced. So after these 3 years, the European Union would have less money to spend. And already it had a very small, minuscule amount of money that was 1% of the GDP. It would be even less. So in the long run, this does not point to more Europe, so to say. It points to less Europe. And this is what they have decided. It's not what we want or what we wish. This is what is written in the documents. And the second question is that there is the illusion that the so-called conditionality is over. This is not true. Conditionality will keep on being there. And the problem is not only whether it makes economic sense or not, the problem is also the political implications it has, especially because it was already used and was not especially welcome by those who it was applied to. And it also revealed that there were limits. Hayek would say that there was the ambition of knowledge involved, because it implies a sort of micromanagement on the sides of the European Commission that one can doubt if the European Commission is in a position to undertake. Okay, so I have covered all the ground. I have already talked too much. I would only like to say in conclusion that I think the status quo that we have is impossible. We don't know what direction the European Union will be heading. What we can know, is that the cost of another attempt at muddling through has increased because the stakes are in many ways higher. There has been many critics of Germany and of the German Constitutional Court, as I was saying, on the basis of the recent decision on May. I would say I don't agree with the reasoning of the German Constitutional Court, neither with the reasoning of the European Court of Justice, but I think that the questions that the German Constitutional Court poses are essential questions. The ultimate questions are questions of democratic legitimacy and accountability. And we cannot be happy about the fact that an institution that is not politically accountable is taking such transcendental decisions that also imply enormous risks on how they are taken. There is a clear need, one way or the other. Could be more Europe, could be a coordinated dismantlement of the Eurozone. I'm not precluding the issue, but the problem has to be tackled and confronted. Thanks a lot.
I don't know if you heard, you got a round of applause in the auditorium. I don't know if anybody. Right, Agustín. Well, first of all, to the people in the following us in Zoom land, please make use of your question and answer feature on Zoom to ask me questions about this. And while you're making up your mind on this, I'll take some questions. First of all, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and then take questions both from participants in the audience here and online. But Agustín, I really can't. First of all, I mean, I took 12 pages of notes here. You put a lot of meat on the fire, as Italians say here. I'm just going to pick out two things, which I'd like you to react to first. The first is your comment about the crisis has adjusted our lenses. We're seeing things we didn't see before. You reminded me in your work here, and I apologize to the listeners because we're getting technical, very much of Kiran Patel's new book on the European project, who's arguing something extremely similar, and that is saying that we are really creating an entirely new narrative of what happened in European Union, pushing European Union, about what pushed European Union, on the basis of our growing knowledge and understanding of the intricacies of the social and economic changes that have been underway since the 1970s. So my first question is, could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, putting it in a broad context. So this notion that we've broken away from a simplistic, if you like, picture of European integration as being about the gradual creation of institutions, to European integration being about the gradual, being about, as you put it, in fact, emergency responses to the swells and shifts of global finance and global economic change. So that would be my first question. I think my second question, though, would be, I don't want to accuse you of replacing one teleology with another. On the other hand, and following on from my previous question, is it possibly true that we're replacing the idea of a rise of Europe heading almost inexorably towards prosperity and federalism with another picture of the EU as being, in a way, almost like the League of Nations, institutions which are manifestly not able to cope with the scale of the problems that they're facing? I don't know if you heard that. I hope you did.
Yes, I think it would be replacing it would be another teleology if there would be a sense of unavoidability, I would say, or if the element of contingency and agency would not be relevant in the narrative, I would say. But I don't think this is not a proper way of thinking about it. I was using the example of the European monetary system. They really did not, if you go back to the debates, I mean, for example, The Economist was at the time, which was a different paper in many ways, much more sober than is now, black and white, more even more letter and less photographs and this kind of stuff. But it was covering in quite detail the negotiations for the European monetary system. They really did not know exactly what they were heading to, and there was an element of unclarity about the whole thing. It became what it became ex post, and as a result of choices also. A choice on the side, for example, of a Schmidt of accepting the conditions that the Bundesbank was putting before him, which I don't think it was a necessity. There was the alternatives were possible. So it's also this question that I think it is important to go and look back to the past in order to see also paths not taken and alternatives that were possible. In this case, there is no theology. In the same way that I am not saying that the European Union is doomed, not at all. This is not the point. I think that it can be said that this doom is nothing if we keep on the same track as we are not in a very comfortable position. As I was saying, for example, there is this element of divergence, and there is a limit of divergence that you can have in a functional monetary union. And I think they know it, both in the central bank and the commission. They know it, and they know that the problem is there. The question is whether they are able to overcome the different hurdles in order to take decisions that avoid the prophecy self-fulfilling itself. The first question is bigger, and I don't think I would be able to answer it properly now or ever. But I think the question very obviously, there is an interplay there, because on the one hand, there are external forces, on the other hand are internal forces. I think external forces, occasionally, they have been much emphasized, not necessarily in the history of European integration, but in the history of Europe. You have worked on the Cold War, you know much better than I do, but also at the level of constitutional lawyers, at some point they were. So, for example, to what extent things like the NATO treaty or the arrangements for international payments that were made in the 50s were creating mayor in a neutral way, vincolo externo, so to say. No? So there were external constraints that were conditioning the process. At the same time, very obviously, as I was pointing, there is this relevance of national developments. I mean, one thing, for example, that I think it tends occasionally to be underemphasized is in some circles. Then there are others that, for right or wrong, have rightly stressed that, but then they are not part of the mainstream at all. For example, how the way in which we got the independence of the central bank accepted was the result, on the one hand, of getting used to the hegemony of the Bundesbank in many European countries, but also of Thatcher being out of power, because she was a staunch defender of the political control of the central bank. This is sometimes forgotten because this is supposed to be a left-wing idea, but the dependence of the central bank is not necessarily a left-wing idea. Thatcher was not left-wing. I think on this we can be very obvious. But a proper answer to your question would require me more than this mumbling that I'm doing now. But I will think about it.
We'll come back to that one next time we see each other, because I think there's quite a lot that we can talk about here. I think one of the things that struck me about your talk is that you're working in between how can institutions, transnational institutions with very complex processes, respond to crises caused in its environment, and to what extent is it possible? It's to what extent are the shifts in the underlying forces at work in the global economy, in European society? You talk, for example, about how social democracy was already, the European social democratic model was already running out of steam in the 1960s, and to some extent our prosperity has been continued as a result of ever-increasing private debt. To what extent can institutions that were constructed in the post-war European context, which have been developed, improvised, changed as things have gone on, to what extent are they fit for purpose, given the scale of the challenges that we're facing? I think that's more the point I was trying to make. Will the house stand? There's an earthquake going on. There are earthquakes going on. To what extent has the construction, the European construction, been earthquake-proof? You see what I'm getting at?
Yes, but then now I see more clearly. But then, very obviously, for example, something that can be immediately observed is that there was even an element of renunciation of this capacity to deal with the environment. Yeah. The idea of planning, for example, okay, there was Hayek was deeply against planning. There was the debates with Barbara Button. This is part of the historical record. But by the end of the Second World War, the idea of planning again was not necessarily partisan, was part of the mainstream. Monet was a planner, a different type of planner than the socialist planner, but a planner. And this implies that you want to control your environment, or you expect that you will need to control your environment. This was renounced. And the fact that the socioeconomic model coming from the post-war was no longer working did not necessarily entail that you should renounce an element of control of the environment. The most obvious case is free movement of capital. After Second World War, there was a clear, I pointed to that, but I think this is obvious. There was more sophistication about what we are talking here about. This is reflected to this day in the architecture of the treaties, which has not been changed. On the one hand, you have free movement. The structure of the chapter is that you have free movement, agriculture, the other three freedoms. So free movement of goods comes first, agriculture comes second, and then you have the other three freedoms, and free movement of capital was understood as freedom of payments. So you want trade, and you want workers to move, but you want to avoid the pitfalls of the destabilization of your socioeconomic structure by what in the interwar period they call the hot money movements and this kind of stuff. This was not sustainable, most probably, as it was as it was created in the post-war period. But the idea that you have to keep the capacity to intervene, the idea, for example, the Germans have kept it, the idea that you keep on needing a public bank that is capable to steer economic development, that you don't take too seriously certain ideas, architectonic ideas about how a free economy works and this kind of stuff. This collapsed in the 80s, I think, very obviously. And this is something that I think we are relearning that was a mistake that we made. And again, this is not an ideological issue. This is a question about how you make to function a complex socioeconomic structure.
Okay, I've just had a question. Is the season of European constitutionalism definitively over? Somebody has asked very, very precisely.
I am not a futurologist. I cannot know. What I think is the naivety about European constitutionalism is over. Something like we experienced in 2000, and we were all naive, or most of, or at least I was naive. I'm not saying, oh, everything was clear and there were all these that made mistakes. I was also a sinner, if you wish. But the question very there is that the naivety with which the issue was approached, I think it is over. And I think that is partially good, in the sense that when I heard before the crisis, still there was this idea of we need a constituent assembly of Europe and this kind of stuff. The risks of starting a constitutional process and it failing, I think that should make people think twice. Do we need a constitutional change as such, or do we need to have a clear idea of what are the institutional decision-making process and substantive changes that we need? This is not solved by a constitution-making process. Still, for example, Macron, if you consider it, keeps on having, perhaps it's a question of public diplomacy and should not be taken too seriously. But this idea of the deliberation days, deliberation structures and this kind of stuff. If you judge on the basis of French politics itself, it seems that it's more scenography than actual politics, so to say.
Another question: the addiction to emergency government, to use your phrase. Somebody's asking, what exactly you mean by that? How does that work? Why is the EU addicted to emergency government?
The problem is the following: what is a blessing is also a curse. Why do I say that? In the 80s, Fritz Scharf explained to us why this is so. The legitimacy of the European Union, and for very good reasons, keeps on coming from the member states, mostly. But this has a price, and the price is that you have to decide jointly. The more that you put things to decide in common, and the more member states that you have, the more that you can feel you are in a trap. And that's the joint decision trap. This, together with the fact that there are no specific emergency provisions in the treaties. The treaties were an international treaties. They did not contain provisions for emergency legislation. Il decreto legge, as it exists in Italy, does not exist on European law. Creates, on the one hand, a situation in which you have all the pressures at the end of the day to decide through emergency, because you will be blocked, and challenges will degenerate into crisis. And we have seen it all through. And at the same time, you don't have any kind of discipline of how you decide in these kind of situations. The result is that crises become a mode of government. And I think we are seeing that in the European Union, that there is no hope of taking ordinary decisions, and sometimes it's a question of waiting until we reach the point of crisis, and then we will intervene. This creates an addiction, but a very dangerous addiction, because emergencies are by definition dangerous. As I was saying, not only from a democratic point of view, even if this is very important, also because you make mistakes. Because in an emergency room, there are lots of protocols. You don't improvise. You follow a script. If you don't have the script, you can make enormous mistakes. And I think there were quite a number of mistakes, for example, during the fiscal crisis. If you remember, for example, at some point, I mean, this is for obsessives, people that are obsessed about the crisis. But if you remember, there was some point at which Sarkozy and Merkel had a romantic walk in Deauville.
Deauville, yeah, 2010.
They made a major blunder at that point. This was totally uncalled for. And this is because they were basically making as they went. So this kind of understanding that the German president, the French president, out of several weeks in which you had Sunday meetings that had to close before the Japanese East Asian markets open, justifies that you take whatever decision, led to a major mistake that complicated very much the fiscal crisis of the Eurozone.
You're almost making it seem, I'm interjecting here, but I just had a comment to the same effect, that the European Union almost needs crises to make decisions.
But I'm not making it. On the one hand, there is a certain number of actors that had responsibility, for example, in the Maastricht Treaty, Prodi, for example, that is on record in these terms. We have not decided now. There will come a crisis, and then we will be able to take further decisions. Also, other actors. I'm thinking here, for example, of the former president of the Commission. Now it escapes my memory. This is completely unacceptable. The Luxembourgeois, Juncker, for example, is on record with several thoughts. But it's not only so to say, you could see that these are circumstantial claims, or they are reconstructing ex post what they were saying and this kind of stuff. What I'm saying is a bit different, because I'm emphasizing the danger. I'm not saying this is an opportunity. This could be an opportunity, perhaps, but it's very risky to do it that way. I think there are very good reasons to find that this is extremely problematic.
One of our students, who is a correspondent for an American newspaper in Budapest, just asked, you referred to Eastern enlargement as those countries coming home to Europe. What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
That you referred to Eastern enlargement to countries, Romania and Poland and Hungary and so forth, as those countries coming home to Europe. What did you mean by that? Because it's not as if these countries were on a par, democratic institutions, economically, socially, etc., with Western Europe, even before Soviet occupation.
Yeah, but the point, I was probably misquoting or misparaphrasing a term that was used in these countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, joining the European Union will be a matter of coming home, precisely because they were feeling European in sentimental and also in intellectual terms. Joining the European Union after the fall of the Berlin Wall would be overcoming an artificial separation imposed by the Cold War, the Soviet Russia, whatever you want. And this explains also the extent to which, contrary, for example, to other transition processes, there was not much debate about what eventually, and there was not much drama about the idea of constitution making itself, because it was pretty obvious what would be in the constitution. It was a question of becoming European. There was already a standard there. This creates the opportunity down the road for leaders like Orban to claim that, in his own words, now the wind should be blowing from the east, because this is presented as something alienating. So there was an element of betrayal of your national identity, because you were too easily buying into something that was reflecting, of course, the European character of Hungary, but not taking into account what Hungary itself could contribute to Europe, or Hungary had contributed to Europe. I think is in neutral terms, I would say that Hungary has a very long history and a history of centrality through the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe, and this hurts if this is not one way or the other recognized in symbolic terms. And I think this is the problem. This is why some Eastern Europeans, not many, but some Eastern European legal scholars have talked about alienating constitutionalism. I don't like the word, because it's, you know, alienation evokes all kind of implications, but I think it is quite descriptive that what happened, and this idea also of the negotiation with the Soviet, with the post-Soviet, or the legacy of the Soviet, the former Soviets trying to recycle themselves, this very peaceful and very exemplary in this kind of transition, then had a price in the long term.
Okay, well, just one last question actually from me, Agustín, which is just cropped up in my mind as I heard you answering the other people's questions, which I'm sure everybody found extremely helpful and illuminating. Is it possible for the European Union to survive a democratic crisis in which some of its member states are clearly heading, or have, if some of its member states go beyond eulogies for illiberalism and pass over into some form of authoritarianism? I mean, surely so much of what European integration has been about, really, particularly since the 60s. I mean, one thinks of your own country, Portugal, and in the 1990s has been associated with a sense of democratic expansion, and that European integration was part of it. I mean, could the European Union, again, I don't want to ask you to be a futurologist, but I mean, as an institutional fact, could the European Union cope with a democratic recession?
The question is how the European Union can be smart about dealing with the problem. And I would say, being a lawyer, I would say that the last right solution is to judicialize the conflict, as some of my colleagues think is a good thing. So the European Court of Justice tells Poland how they should behave and this kind of stuff. I think this is not very constructive. I think that's not the smart solution. But very obviously, it has to be taken deeply seriously for the reasons that you were referring to. But it has to be taken seriously also in the external action of the European Union. I'm thinking, for example, about the refugee statement, so-called statement, with Turkey, which it was a major mistake for many reasons. Legally speaking, it was supposed not to involve the European Union, and the European Court of Justice bought into that. I think this is bizarre, because there was the heads of state and government, and then they pretended they were in a personal, with a national hat. They were not the European Union. This was supposed not to be an agreement, but merely exchange of declarations. I think that's very bizarre, because very obviously it was an agreement. And thirdly, because it placed the European Union in a position of extreme weakness vis-a-vis Turkey, Erdogan's Turkey, to be more precise, which is not exactly a champion of refugee rights, so to say. This all has been accumulating in a way, in terms of, instead of offering an answer and challenging this kind of growth, resulting in tolerance. You can see it very clearly. I mean, because the way in which we are discussing again about the rule of law in terms of the coronavirus crisis is in terms of making conditions again. Is not thinking smart. It's thinking about punishment one way or the other. Orban thrives with these kind of strategies. They are even, perhaps you would have heard it, they are putting together the equivalent of Horizon 2020 research programs in order to finance researchers in Hungary and Poland that are critical of the European Union. There is an element of mimicking here. But on the one hand, it's very obvious what is the purpose. On the other hand, it should make us think again whether there is an element of compromising of intellectual independence, sometimes taking into account some of the goals of the Horizon 2020 programs. So before we start being very moralizing about what they are doing, but that's the question. In short, I think this is a critical issue. I think when they were acting regarding Austria in 2000, they were not being smart, but they were still the right understanding that there should be a red line being drawn, and this has melted over the years. And I think this is a problem for the reasons that you are saying, that it's very difficult to imagine that you could cope with that. But think, as we are talking, people are going to jail in Turkey because they are opposing Erdogan. Judges have been put in jail, and the European Court of Human Rights has been saying you have to go to the Constitutional Court because you have to exhaust the local remedies. The Constitutional Court having self-purged itself. So something is deeply wrong with that. A principal position should be taken on that, because if the European Convention and the European Union are supposed to be useful for something, is in order to protect these minimum standards.
Well, I can only thank you, Agustín, for a very wide-ranging, very stimulating, very thought-provoking talk. I wish I could do what we normally do when somebody gives a speech and give you a wine stopper. I assure you I will unstop some wine the next time you come to visit. I shall look forward to meeting you again fairly soon, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of SAIS for giving such a fantastic overview of some of the challenges that Europe's facing now. Thanks very much. I'll be in.
Well, thanks to you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye. And yeah.